Local Futures, Reclaiming Our Humanity, Regenerating Our Earth. Presented by Helena Norberg-Hodge. localfutures.org. This is consciousearthalliance.com.
I'm very happy to be here and to be talking about this important topic. And people may know that for a long time I've been promoting the creation of strong community and local economies. And that this came from my experience in Ladakh, or what's also been called Little Tibet, where I had the great privilege of learning to speak the language of this people, the Tibetan culture, people who spoke an ancient Tibetan dialect. And I had come out there in 1975, shortly after the area had been opened up to the outside world. And it was one of the very few places in the world where Christian missionaries or slave drivers and colonizers had not transformed the local economy and the local culture. So I had the great privilege of getting to know people who were still in charge of their own resources, their own water, their own land, to produce for their own needs as a priority, and to trade where it made sense. I found that in Ladakh, there was no such thing as unemployment. There was none of the pollution that we know in the modern world, and there were not most of the illnesses that we have in the modern world. There was certainly a higher infant mortality, but even that was not anything like as great as we are led to believe. And certainly the life expectancy with people who had survived the early sort of 3 years or so was very good. In fact, probably now very close to what the life expectancy would be in America. But we are not being given honest statistics about this. We're still being told that, oh, there's only more cancer now because we're living longer. We're being told that, oh, we all used to die at 40. And this is simply not true. There's plenty of evidence over the generations of people who came into contact with indigenous or traditional cultures who had maintained a good balance with the land and who had provided for their own needs for generations. And there was, even among missionaries who came to Ladakh in the 1700s and the 1800s, a great admiration for the culture. Almost all of the reports from those missionaries reported, as I did, on people being the happiest they had ever encountered, the high status of women, the honesty and integrity of the people. And yet these Christian missionaries were still trying to improve them by bringing Christianity instead of their combination of Buddhism and animism. They didn't succeed very much. There was a small community of Christians when I arrived because they'd been able to convert a few orphans. But what I witnessed there was the dramatic changes brought as the Indian government chose to open Ladakh to the outside economy and to start developing Ladakh. And I saw, some of the dramatic changes I saw were things like food that had been transported for several weeks coming into the local economy, selling for less than food from a 5-minute walk away from the main market in Leh, Ladakh. And that included butter. I remember butter coming, almond butter, that had been transported for weeks, selling for half the price of local butter. This led me later on, when I returned to my native country of Sweden, having spent a couple of years in Ladakh and also working with Ladakhis and Tibetans in Dharamsala to learn more of the language. I learned to speak the language fluently, actually fairly quickly, but I was also learning the writing and grammar and so on in Dharamsala. When I went back to Sweden in 77, I discovered, because I was alert to this, that the transformation in the food economy meant that in Sweden, the biggest food corporation was Philip Morris, because Philip Morris had bought Kraft, and that at that stage was the biggest food corporation. I became very aware also that the Ladakis changes that I was witnessing, which were psychological, were also paralleled in Sweden. I saw in Ladakh how people who had the deepest self-esteem, the deepest genuine confidence of any people I had ever encountered, were suddenly made to feel inferior, to feel imperfect, and to become depressed. It was particularly true among the women. Now, this is among people who had been the most joyous, the most full of vitality and just happiness. And I saw how the impact, particularly on children, very rapidly created the feeling that we're not good enough the way we are. We need to be looking like these Westerners, and we need to be living this urban consumer lifestyle. Otherwise, we're not worthwhile. So I saw the beginnings of self-rejection and depression among young people. So when I returned to Sweden, I was also more alert to these psychological factors. And the contrast between Ladakh, traditional Ladakh, and Sweden was so stark. In Sweden, depression, suicide, alcoholism were quite common. And it became so clear why. People had been driven off the land, destroying that diversified, decentralized way of living, closer to nature, a bit more self-reliant. Actually, I don't like to use the term self-reliant. I like to use the term community-reliant. This is really how it functioned everywhere in the past. And so I saw that, yes, no wonder that people were depressed and that there was alcoholism and suicide, because people were now driven off the land, living in these high-rise flats. And in Stockholm at that time, in 1977, I discovered that more than half of all the dwellings in Stockholm were inhabited by one person living alone. And then I became so aware of the difference and what happens to children growing up in an intergenerational, extended family and community structure. So this became a very, very important issue for me. And the combination of seeing the destruction of the local economy and the imposition of artificially cheap products and the breakdown in self-esteem, and with it the breakdown of joy and human well-being. These are two of the factors, and there were many, many others, but those were key factors that led me very early on to essentially become very interested in the eco-village movement and doing everything I could to encourage an understanding that we need to decentralize instead of continuing to urbanize society. Now, as you all probably know, the global economy, which has become particularly strong since the mid-'80s. In other words, when I say the global economy has become strong, I mean that in that period, from about the mid-'80s on, there were a series of trade treaties that were being ratified by governments around the world, and essentially they were under pressure from global banks and corporations to allow a freedom for global conglomerates. Free trade treaties was about freedom for big global banks and multinational companies to move in and out of local, regional, and national economies worldwide. Giving those businesses more freedom was something that many ministers in governments, I think even prime ministers I met, and activists, environmental activists, social activists, most people were simply not aware that this was an extremely destructive process. And it was also a process that was kept fairly quiet. Those in big business who were pushing this agenda were aware that they did not want people to shed the light on what these treaties meant. So most of the discussion of globalization since the mid-'80s until today has been kept essentially quiet, to the extent that there's been a discussion in academia or ever in the media. The discussion has kept up this basically false narrative of this being about relationships between governments. China is doing this, America is doing this, trade between Australia and the UK and Australia and Japan, not spelling out clearly, this is not very much about relationships between countries. This is about giant multinationals having more freedom and now essentially cut off from any loyalty to their origins. So when in Sweden recently, the government voted, this is about 3 or 4 years ago, to ensure that trade treaties were negotiated in secrecy. It was very clear to me and to a few journalists, but not in the mainstream media, they don't get in, that this was crazy. But when you try to understand the mindset of the people who are promoting this, the fact is that they are naively thinking, oh, well, Volvo, compared to Rover or other car factories, General Motors, Volvo, of course, is going to have trade secrets. So, of course, the trade treaties need to be kept in secrecy because they still naively believe that helping their multinationals is actually helping their own country. Now, that is my sense of how it is that so many governments are continuing to allow for governments to become more and more subservient to what is actually a de facto empire of interlinked banks and corporations that are essentially running our world. They are in control of the mainstream media. They are in control of most of our governments and almost certainly helped by the military, particularly the Pentagon. It's a very disturbing and frightening situation, particularly now in light of COVID and the pharmaceutical industry. But all the time from the 70s until now, because I was very actively trying to encourage more land-based, decentralized, localized economies, I've been in touch with the grassroots in many countries. And I wrote a book called Ancient Futures, and we made a film by the same title, and that was translated into about over 40 languages. And so I had information from, Myanmar, at that time Burma, Laos, Bolivia. I went to see the Maasai. I was invited to Mongolia. Anyway, I had a mandate from a lot of people around the world, many of whom either were living in more traditional communities, but usually people like that who had had an experience of the West, people who had a bit of an experience of the most urbanized, commercialized, industrialized parts of the world, and those who also experienced more land-based, community-based, ways of living. Those were the people who were very, very keen on our work. And all this time, I see all around the world people trying to get back home, trying to get back to nature and to community. This sounds rather simplistic, but this clarity about the diverging paths that have been playing out for quite a while. I mean, I would argue almost from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Well, in fact, definitely, I would argue that even preceding that, there have been movements and thinkers who have been urging us to return to our home, to Mother Gaia, to nature, and even before the Industrial Revolution, because Christianity was starting to take us on this journey away from nature towards a very patriarchal, Western-dominated system. So for me, what is very clear is that humanity is not shaping this trajectory. This is not a question of human beings being so greedy, wanting to live in high-rise, fossil fuel-based apartments far above the earth, sometimes with nothing alive, cement, plastic, steel, plastic plants, sometimes literally no life, and more isolated. This is the phenomenon of this modern trajectory. It separates us more and more from one another. It's deadly, and it's a monoculture. It imposes monoculture on the land and a human monoculture, consumer monoculture. Now, you no longer need to be white, blonde, and blue-eyed. You're allowed to be Asian or black, but the heroes and the images are Western-style consumer culture, urban images that are still continuing to destroy esteem for more rural, more intergenerational, more community-based ways of living, and ways of living where we use our hands, where we develop a multitude of skills, where we live in ways that are more participatory, more collaborative. So seeing how much pressure there has been to take us away from nature, and I argue in my book, away from human nature, because human beings evolved connected to the living world, to each other, old and young, beautifully paired in traditional communities. There is nothing more beautiful than the youngest and the oldest in a traditional community and see how they were made for each other. There's nothing more beautiful than seeing that when we live in a way that allows us to see the people on whom we depend, the land, the water, the earthworms, the trees that we depend on for our survival. When people are allowed to live in that way, they cannot be as blind and greedy and stupid as they become, and they're cut off from that. Because in the modern system, our life becomes a world of abstractions and concepts. When we get back to the reality of what we depend on, we are different. We're not always perfect. It's not always without any conflict, not perfect sustainability, but it structurally not only enables us to live in a genuinely more sustainable, genuinely happier way, healthier way, but it actually in many ways encourages and even imposes greater intelligence, greater humility. Because what the big difference is when we are close to that bit of land that's going to feed us, and those trees that might provide wood for our houses, when we are close to them, we could never develop an indicator like GDP. In some village in India or anywhere, no one who has any intelligence would say, wow, we cut down every tree on the mountain, this is progress. Let's call that success. It's not possible. But that's what's going on in the modern system. The madness of the modern economy is something that we really need to include in our understanding as we try to move towards more self-reliant, more genuinely sustainable communities. I'm trying to say it's really very, very helpful that we spend some time to become more eco-literate. And by that, I mean both economically literate and ecologically literate. And the two together is what we desperately need. In fact, I need to add to that psychologically, culturally literate, because this other dimension of the need for community, the need for more intergenerational relationships to increase genuinely collaborative activity and action. That's the cultural dimension that's often missing in the deep ecology movement in the West. So there is this huge amount of learning that I had from Ladakh. And most of what I'm saying from Ladakh you can find, but generally it will be in books that might go back 200 years. Because at the time when I sort of had the privilege of living in Ladakh, in most parts of the world, slavery, colonialization, the enclosures in Europe had already so decimated more collaborative, more ecological ways of living. So I think really being clear about this dimension, and I just want to say one more thing about it, and that is that in the modern world, this has consisted, this dominant economic trajectory has consisted into every economic activity, this supposed cheap energy, cheap oil. Can you hear me?
Yes, just now there was a bit of blocking. We could hear your voice, but for example, your picture was blocked.
Yeah. Is it okay now?
Yeah,
Yeah, I can see my.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't know if I should change it to.
I think it should be fine if you continue.
Yeah, actually, I might change it to this so that I think it might be better like this. So, yeah. So I wanted to say that the absolute tragedy that's going on now is that most environmentalists, most social activists are not looking at this craziness that's going on. Is that
it's again blocked a bit. It's again disturbed, Helena.
Between using the internet, is that better now?
Yeah, there was another disturbance just last half minute.
It's okay now?
Now it's okay.
Okay. Yeah, so the thing I wanted to say is that energy has been inserted into our lives, into our communities, into our economies, posing as inexpensive, so that our governments are arguing that it's efficient to remove people from the land and grow food with lots of fossil fuels, big machines, replacing hundreds of millions of people, and now threatening to remove virtually all farmers from the land. And we have a completely fake economy where human labor is becoming too expensive for all of us. And it's an utter fraud because we have paid through wars, our taxes, for not only for the energy, but the energy intensive infrastructure. And between regulations and taxes and subsidies, our governments are completely distorting the economy to imprison us in a way where we cannot afford ourselves. On a crowded planet, I feel the most important message we should be sharing is that we have plenty of human labor. Many would argue too much. Energy and resources are scarce. We need immediately to switch over to a labor-intensive economy and reduce energy consumption. And this, for humanity, would be a huge gift in the right direction. We're not talking about eliminating every technology or every beneficial use of energy for human needs, but we are talking about being liberated out of a prison where a handmade pot or a hand-built house, handmade clothing, organic, genuinely healthy, diversified production, and the food that comes from that are all being made too expensive, except for a tiny elite. And the tiny elite clearly shows that they prefer the natural, they prefer the handmade. Many elite people, from Prince Charles to now many Silicon billionaires, are finding they prefer farming to any other economic activity they've done. There is a huge interest and demand for a more natural way of life, for more natural product, and for more artisan production. Now, I just really hope more of you will help to articulate this, because there are not many people saying what I'm saying, and I think it's because they've lost perspective. And the imprisonment that we're talking about, the scarcity of humans, is not just affecting food production, but healthcare, education, any type of meaningful education. In mental health, it's a nightmare. I even had a psychologist or psychiatrist telling me years ago, you're right, I'm seeing at Harvard now that I don't have time to talk to a depressed person or a suicidal person, but I'm being encouraged to hand out more and more pharmaceuticals, quick pill, and they'll calm down. And we know, anyway, there's just too much to say, but I think really, really important for shifting towards the life that we are talking about here, more sovereign, self-reliant communities, and the vital need for it will be so helped by more economic literacy. And like I say, it needs to be linked to cultural and ecological literacy, because I'm working with many new economists, very often men, from the West, who haven't had experience of the way that more artisan production can not only be so much more beautiful, so much more efficient, so much more using resources so much more carefully, but that it can be enjoyable. And this is something that now in the eco-village movement, in the permaculture movement, in the transition town movement, in these movements, more and more people in both the industrialized world and in the less industrialized world are realizing. But this is a knowledge that needs to be spread urgently, far and wide, because the constant propaganda, we are colonized through every avenue of knowledge. Every avenue of knowledge has been colonized by big money. It's the media, it's schooling, it's science. And this is not to say that all the people involved in these endeavors are corrupt and terrible people. It's much more systemic. It's narrow over-specialization linked to a trajectory where the dominant narrative keeps telling us this is progress. And people are not stepping back to look at the big picture and to realize that we're embarking now, after COVID, on a choice between moving towards the pressure from above is we will be 100% urbanized in AI-driven cities, and we'll have a nice little ring of rewilding. Fine, rewilding is fine. It'll be sort of a bit around us. And then we're going to have farming, which will be with robots linked to drones, linked to satellite to monitor carbon. This is a nightmare scenario, and it ultimately cannot work because it's very resource intensive and so destructive of human creativity, of human genuine individualism and diversity. Individual diversity, genuine individualism, genuine creativity, genuine entrepreneurship, if you like, but also cultural diversity. So it's a path that's linked to allowing some little boy billionaires to go racing off to Mars to compete over scarce minerals and working with the military and the high-tech industry to find ways to go to the deepest depths of the sea to search for more minerals. That's the one leg that's being pushed by our governments, unfortunately, because this hegemonic, interlinked banking and corporate structure is dominating. On the other side, I have no doubt whatsoever that the majority of human beings on this planet are really ready to hear that we're too dominated by big business and that big government is not serving our needs. Well, there's a lot to say here, but we have to be careful of a sort of right-wing perspective which only looks at big government but does not consider big business. And that can often become a counterproductive vision of laissez-faire economics. There's probably too much to go into that right now.
One
To
thing I wanted
strengthen this movement. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, one thing I really wanted to ask you, because it's so true about this, that practically going away from nature, we are also destroying our human nature, because we were made for thousands and thousands of years living in nature. And now, for example, Zuckerberg is coming with this idea of metaverse. And he wants to bring everyone that is inside this total abstract world where no one will even have contact with each other anymore. Exactly what you were saying, that we learn to live in apartments alone, and now in metaverse we will live the whole day just in this abstract situation without relationships. What if you could say something?
Yeah, no, this is what I'm saying, is that this is the fork in the road after COVID, which has been strengthened, this dependence on the internet, on more and more technology, and going into more and more abstraction. In fact, the FAO has been arguing that people don't want to farm, but they like to be on the screen. So they're already imposing in parts of Africa, testing this farming where they say, oh, people like to be on the screen. So these young men can be on the screen, and then robots will do the farming, linked to drones, linked to satellite to measure carbon. So the carbon narrative has come from big business. It was a way of allowing big business to keep growing. Sorry about that. It was a way of allowing big business to keep growing while trading in carbon. And, just unbelievable. And it's tragic that so many environmentalists have not seen through that. And then the tragic thing that can sometimes happen is that then people reject altogether the notion that there is any issue of climate change, which I think is unfortunate. I think there's no doubt that fossil fuels have had a negative effect on not only on the climate, but on the soil, on biodiversity, through the chemicals, the chemical fertilizers. So really important that we look at this in an honest and clear way. But I think, so I feel that our biggest problem is how can we get through this co-opted situation where big money is preventing some of the basic, clear facts from getting out. So I think we have to put much more effort into what I call big picture activism. How can we get this bigger picture out to say, watch out, this movement away from nature, just as you were saying, is a movement away from who we are by nature. It's a movement of massively going against our mental, emotional, psychological, spiritual nature and our social nature, because this disconnection from people is deadly. We knew that. I mean, we know that even monkeys, if those baby monkeys are not held and carried, they die. Well, again, what I saw in the traditional culture was that when you have an expanded intergenerational family, which I know is not easy for us to return to, but I saw the amazing gift of more hands, so that every parent had about 10 live-in caretakers for every child. The wealth that represents, the joy that it represents, the security for the child that it represents. And this is why still, I would argue, in most of the third world, there is not the same degree of mental illness, of insecurity that you have in the industrialized world. Because reduced down to the nuclear family, we've created something that becomes very destructive. I want to honor all of us, including me. I grew up in a nuclear family, and I always say that mothers who didn't strangle their children in that nuclear family all, deserve multiple gold medals, because it is such an unnatural situation, and yet they managed. But now what's happening? Sorry?
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I think it was.
No, go on. Go on. I agree with you 100%. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I made some noise here.
That's all right. That's okay.
I would just like to say.
Yeah.
I would just like to say, those environmentalists that you're talking about, they're not confused. They're criminals. They're criminals. They're being bought.
Yeah, but I don't know. I feel I really have met, for instance, Bill McKibben. Did you see him attacked in Michael Moore's film? Do you know Michael Moore's film?
Yeah.
Yes.
I've known Bill McKibben since the 70s. He was a journalist, and he actually interviewed me for The New Yorker in the 70s. And my experience of Bill is not that he's a criminal, but I just see, what I keep seeing is that when people get into a position of power, they end up allowing the vision to narrow. And very often that narrow vision will be, well, I know, Helena, I know you're right, but I can't change the whole system, and I'm just trying to do the best I can. So it may be a sort of self-serving narrowing, because they're getting a certain amount of power and attention, which I certainly think happens in politics. I've known so many people who were environmental activists, social activists, went into power, and then suddenly they were on the other side. I've seen it again and again. I've also seen some of those people retire and come back to a bigger picture, sensible conclusion. It's not so much, I see it much more as this probably a desperate desire to belong is one of it. I think we all want to belong. And once you start going into this group where there are certain things you can't say because it's too naive or too unrealistic. I've had men say to me, I agree with you, Helena, but I don't want to be marginalized. So I think we need to be I think it's important that we maintain compassion for those people, but above all, keep in mind that the discourse we need today is not with the people in power. It's among us. We need to be linking up the grassroots much more, and we need to have greater clarity about what kind of policies we are going to insist on. We have to build up. There's not been a movement for this economic change. We started building one up in the anti-globalization movement, but we weren't spelling out. I was trying to, but most others were not trying to spell out, what do we want? And so we need to get our act together, and I believe that we can mobilize a lot of people. But I know some of you may be thinking, like a lot of people, that all I can do is focus on setting up a local community or a local project. I'm trying to encourage people to do both. We can't all do both, but I guess I'm trying to say, number one, to start building this more sovereign, self-reliant way of living, I would say the number one task is to connect with some like-minded people. So we always like to try to lead people with 5 words: connect, rethink, resist, renew, and celebrate. And so the first connect, vital is to connect, as I say, with a few like-minded people. And that can immediately change the I to a we. It can immediately broaden the horizons of how much we can accomplish. But just as importantly, it can start giving us a sense of belonging, which is vital, particularly now after COVID, a sense of belonging that is absolutely essential for our healing, for our human healing. We've been far too cut off on this journey of modernity from one another. And we are so afraid to be ourselves. We're so afraid to be imperfect. Part of the connection that I would encourage is a deeper healing. It's almost like the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, which the programs that really work are community-based. People are making a journey together because that connection to others is so fundamental in our DNA. That's how we evolved. And as we connect to others, to simultaneously then be looking at what can we do and how can we rethink assumptions that we may be holding. And I would say most of us have. We've been so brainwashed for so long about progress and about why something more community-based, something more ecological can't possibly work. We have assumptions. One of the biggest is about education. The schooling has been a fundamental, central vehicle to remove people from the land and to remove people from genuine skills and self-respect. So I'm still disappointed in the number of colleagues and friends I have who still want to send their children into the mainstream educational system. It's disastrous for many, many reasons. And yet I'm not in any way lobbying for people to be uneducated. I see education as the most important activity we can engage in. And that means both, on many different levels. But anyway, so the rethinking is rethinking some very basic assumptions that we may be holding that undermine ourselves. I'm met with this all the time when I try to help start local food economies. I'm seeing people who are still caught up in the idea, well, the local and the organic is more expensive, and therefore it becomes elitist. And this is even after you've spoken for like hours about how this is a completely fake economy, that people still undermine themselves by believing the sort of reality of the economic values that we're living in. But we have to expose these. This is part of what we've got to do. Right and left have been subsidizing energy, global infrastructure, global corporations to advertise, while they have been deregulating them, over-regulating all local, regional, national, place-based businesses and activities, over-regulating. I mean, some of that regulation may be valid, but when that happens at the same time that the global are deregulated and the global are subsidized while all the rest are paying tax, we've created a playing field that can only destroy us. So we need to be looking at some of these things. And then And the rethinking then ideally will lead to a clarity about what to resist. And we need to be resisting this energy-intensive, techno-intensive path to embrace this genuinely human and ecological path and the decentralizing, localizing path. And this resistance and renewal can go together, because as we articulate our resistance to this imprisoning system, it also helps to bring more people on board towards the localizing ecological community path. And the final thing about celebrate is we feel, and have for a long time, that the celebration of life, the celebration of everything that lives, once we become aware of how vital it is to connect to the living world. So once we become aware of how incredible and magical life is, as we start slowing down and reconnecting, and we need to do both. We need to slow down to reconnect and celebrate and renew, but we also need to speed up our resistance and our analysis of the dominant system. So we need to be, functioning on different levels. And if we have a local group, some people will be much more equipped to just help to do the garden or maybe build houses. Other people may be more equipped to do some of the analysis of the economic structures and help to spread the word. So not every single person has to do everything. But what I do believe is that everyone ideally would have some idea of the bigger picture, because without the bigger picture, we often get caught up in looking from a far too local perspective. And then what that's doing is feeding self-blame, cultural self-blame, and the blame of our national government. So I hear it all the time, in India, Indian government's done this, and, in Sweden, it's just because we've done this, or in America, it's just this. No, we're dealing with a global system that became very clearly organized in the era of slavery, genocide, force, enclosure, slavery, genocide. That global system came about, and that global system has been playing a massive and fundamental role in shaping the trajectory of development, progress, and with the help of the Pentagon and the military, imposing that across the world. So the human race, in my experience, has been saying for a very long time, we want a better relationship with nature. We want to have more community. We value the natural. If you look particularly in the industrialized world, you'll find the word eco, alternative, holistic, put in front of everything. Eco-literacy, eco-theology, eco-linguistics. It's just holistic medicine, alternative agriculture. All of it represents in every activity people all over the world seeking a better balance and connection to nature. All across the world, you also will find similar signs that people thrive when they can collaborate. They thrive when they feel connected. They don't want to be fighting to survive. People will, if pushed up against, tremendous stress and so on, yes, you can see violence erupting, you can see hatred, racism, but generally speaking, all the evidence is that we thrive when we're allowed to be in a more collaborative relationship. And yeah. I feel very encouraged by this absolute conviction that this is not what human nature is about. This is not what human beings want. It's an inhuman system. Sorry, so now we have a few questions. We still have time for a few questions.
Question now for people to have enough money to buy land and enough money to build land. So how to do? I just want to add to it that because I wanted something on cooperatives as well, that I saw people starting a cooperative first and then buying the land after, because that is also possible. Or making themselves to create the group first and then starting the land instead of the other way around.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think some of the best initiatives I've seen is that sometimes even in the city, people put up a little flag, we'd like to move out into nature and have a village. And then they might show a film. They've used our film quite a lot, The Economics of Happiness. And now we also have footage from World Localisation Day, which they actually played on Cape Town TV. They were very keen on our work in South Africa. But anyway, they then gather enough like-minded people, and it's a very good process to do, so they also sort out that you do have basic agreement, because it's a very difficult thing to do, coming from our Western individualistic upbringing, but also because the economy is pressuring us all the time. We're like in a pressure cooker. So again, once we can see that we're in a pressure cooker, we might not blame ourselves or the others so much, but rather blame the system and try to see if we can get out from under that pressure. We'll be a lot better off, and we'll all be more relaxed and more tolerant. But anyway, yes, I think it's very, very good to start the group process first. One of the things I'm trying to encourage in different communities also is that we pressure for regulatory change, because almost everywhere in the world, regulations are put in place supposedly to prevent urban sprawl, but they don't prevent developers from coming in and investing to build a huge shopping mall or a huge development, very energy intensive, horrible suburban development. That if someone wants to start an eco-village, the regulations prevent it. And we need to be clear about, again, that this is a global pattern, and we need to come together in our communities and demand regulatory change to allow for more ecological housing in rural areas around towns, because that's where people can also have one foot in the modern world, maybe earning, some money, but live in a more ecological way to build up. This is has huge potential, this, changing the regulations for that, because genuinely ecological developments, for instance, using compost loos and even having your own rainwater catchment in rainwater containers, which we have here in Australia, you can be living in a way that you'll be making almost no negative impact. And on the contrary, once you start growing diversified even food, you can restore more space for wildlife. So you can be healing the land. And we need to be arguing this with local councils and local governments. And there's a bit of change in policy occurring now as pressure from below gets a little bit of recognition from local and regional government. And so we have a localization action guide that you might want to look at on our website, localfutures.org.
Localization action guide. Yeah. And that's your website is localfutures.org. Yeah. Thank you so much, Helena. That was really fantastic, because you really gave an amazing contribution for all of us to understand the big picture of the thing. Why to do this? Why to go to the land? Why to do this effort of getting together? Because even to create a group, of course, it's a lot of work. And but yes, there are a lot of reasons what it means really to do that, to counteract the other movement that is taking away us from nature and away us from our own humanity. That's the main aspect that I think really came out very nicely. Thank you so much. And we hope to have you again some other time.
Thank you. It's very nice to meet you all. So I hope, stay in touch and join our World Localization Day program, which is in June. We're trying to make visible that there is this movement all around the world. For us, the most important entry point is around local food, diversified food production for local needs. And it's very important to use the language of local, diversified, shorter distances, not just say regenerative. Big business is pushing a simple language that can be co-opted. So a lot of what is called regen now is already Nestle and Kellogg's and so on are using that. But if we talk about smaller, more localized, more diversified food systems, that's what we need. And that's the core of a movement that is proving amazingly to grow. I don't even understand how it's possible because all the regulations, all the funding, everything is opposing it. So it's sort of a miracle that it is happening.